Good Shabbos. For me, this has been a rather upsetting week. Right? We'll leave it at that as that clock chimes. Yes. Rather upsetting week. I'm extremely interested in what goes on in the world. I follow the news a lot. And in addition, I've been poring over the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur prayers, who by fire and who by water, who by earthquake and who by plague, who by thirst and who by hunger, who by war. Aside from recent wildfires and floods and pandemics and earthquakes, the events in Afghanistan have been deeply troubling to me. I read and hear about the tens or hundreds of thousands of Afghans who want to get out of that country now and have been actively trying to get out for years. And I think of the story of my own family and of our own people trying to get out of Europe a generation or two ago, and the intense bureaucratic resistance they encountered by this country and others in their attempts to get to safety. And it just reminds me of that history. Not too long ago, I learned that my own family from Austria actually were able to come into this country under the quota for Yugoslavia, since that is where my grandfather was born, actually Belgrade, which was Serbia before there was Yugoslavia, but to parents of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So probably, my guess, the Austrian quota to the United States was full, but there was room in the Yugoslavian quota. In any case, that's how they came in. All of these issues lead to the question of what type of society do we want to live under, and how lucky we seem to be living in this narrow time and place in human history, really a sliver of time and space, this part of the world at this particular moment, because the wealth and liberties of this country for the moment protect us for the moment. There are, of course, rising threats to our safe order in different parts of the world. And it is a question whether we are more or less equipped to protect ourselves from those threats this week than we were 2 weeks ago. And it is self-centered to be only concerned about ourselves when so many others are living with those threats every day. This week's Parshat Ki Tetze takes up a lot of these issues. It describes various different aspects of how society should work. Jewish tradition derives a tremendous amount of social principles from this section of the Torah, Deuteronomy chapters 21 into chapter 25. I encourage you to read this section to see more about what I mean. There are a lot of principles in this section of the Torah that have to do with obligations that the more powerful people in society have to the less powerful people, obligations that the rich have to the poor, obligations that creditors have towards debtors, obligations that employers have towards employees, obligations that society has towards the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the most disadvantaged people in society, obligations a free person has to a runaway slave, obligations that husbands have to wives. And those last categories illustrate part of the problem that we moderns are going to have with a straightforward and simple reading of the text. Because these principles are all illustrated against the backdrop of an ancient Near Eastern society. When you read the details of this social order that the Torah is describing, and when you read it on the simplest, most literal level, it sounds a bit like a society being set up by the Taliban. Unfortunately, the Taliban are reading sacred texts on exactly that simple and literal level, and that is a huge problem. I mean, the Torah has various different beautiful teachings in it, in this section, which talk about, which can be taken almost literally. Like if a borrower is holding something for collateral, holding someone's coat, you can't hold it overnight. You need to let them sleep in it. You have to pay the wages of a laborer that particular day. But there are other teachings in there because of the way society was ordered in that particular time, which if you were to apply it literally, it would be a problem. We, on the other hand, Judaism does not read the Torah on its simplest and most literal level when we look to apply it to life. We do read it on a literal level when we look at it as a historical document. But Jewish tradition long ago concluded that the Torah has many meanings on different levels. The Torah is the first word in Jewish tradition, not the last word. The Torah is the foundation, but you cannot know the experience of living inside a house, in this case, the house of Israel, simply by looking at the foundation. We do pay attention to what the text in its tradition says, because they are our central saga, because these texts tell us who we are, and we see extremely important principles within it. After all, as an example, when you think about it, we in our society, even today, do not often have serious discussions about what the powerful owe to the powerless. Two things we do not do with the Torah. We do not read it and apply it literally in its simplest and least analyzed level. And we do not put it behind glass like a historical museum piece that no longer has a present relevance in life. Instead, we derive principles from the Torah to live by. As an example, where the Torah in this Parsha talks about the obligations that society has to those who are convicted of crimes. Again, the issue of the obligations of the powerful to the powerless. The Torah reads in this week's Parsha that if someone is found guilty by a court of judges and is deserving of punishment, it says, if the guilty one is to be flogged, the judge shall have him lie down and be given lashes in his presence by count, as his guilt warrants. He may be given up to 40 lashes, but not more, lest being flogged further to excess, v'nikla achicha le'einecha, your brother shall be degraded before your eyes. A Taliban reading, a literal reading, and also, by the way, law as it is applied in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the world, will read this literally and simply. The mandate is to give lashes, but not more than 40. Jewish tradition picked up on something else in these verses, however, not the mandate to give lashes. In fact, lashes are not talked about in modern Jewish jurisprudence, to my knowledge. What is picked up upon is the Torah's use of the word brother. The text does not say, lest the criminal be degraded before your eyes, or the convict be degraded before your eyes. It does not say, lest the man will be degraded, or even lest your neighbor be degraded. The text says, lest your brother be degraded before your eyes. That is very strong language for a Torah text that does not use words in excess. The clear message is that the convict is still your brother, is still part of who you are, part of your society, and worthy of dignity. The criminal who is being punished is still not to be degraded. Try out that idea in our society sometime. And it's a very different lesson to derive this sort from the text. It's very different to derive this sort of lesson from the text than you see being derived in other more literalist societies. It's also a very different way from reading sacred texts than you find operating in a lot of fundamentalist or even evangelical Christian circles in the United States, where readings of the Bible are taken as license to disregard the insights of science, or even at times the dictates of common sense. Rather than wrestle with the text in an attempt to discern its fullest meaning, the approach is taken to apply it in its simplest, most literal and straightforward sense, as if that is the most faithful way to read the text, while in fact, it may be the most distorted way to read the text. Midrash speaks of how God gave us wheat with which to make bread, flax reeds with which to make linen, and scripture with which to make meaning. We can choose to chew on raw grains or strap raw reeds to ourselves and live by uninterpreted words, or we can use our God-given talent and natural talent of thought and reason to use what we have been given to build life, to bake bread, to make linen, and to make meaning. A literal reading and application of the text is not the most faithful reading and application of the text necessarily. In fact, literal applications of sacred texts can lead to what the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, called altruistic evil. That is, evil in the name of a sacred cause, evil in the name of high ideals. Rabbi Sacks wrote in his book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, in response to the role of religion in motivating altruistic evil. He notes that he wrote that religion plays a major role in motivating altruistic evil. Yet he also notes that the answer to this problem is not what John Lennon wrote in his lyrics to the word imagine. Imagine nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Remember those words somewhere? In the words of Rabbi Sacks, he writes, by the late 20th century, most secularists had come to the conclusion that religion, if not refuted, had at least been rendered redundant. He notes that science, technology, medicine, surgery, antidepressants, and psychotherapy, advice columns, rock concerts, and sports matches had replaced sacred literature, ritual, prayer, confessionals, sacred holidays, observances, teachings, and practices. He writes, people may now be uncertain about the existence of God, but are reasonably sure that if we don't bother him, he won't bother us. But what the secularists forgot is that Homo sapiens is the meaning-seeking animal. If there is one thing that the great institutions of the modern world do not do, it is to provide meaning. Science tells us how, but not why. Technology gives us power, but cannot guide us as to how to use that power. The market gives us choices, but leaves us uninstructed as to how to make those choices. The liberal democratic state gives us freedom to live as we choose, but on principle refuses to guide us as to how to choose. Questions like, who am I? Why am I here? How then shall I live? Remain unanswered in this situation. When religion is removed, we have a vacuum. And in words that I first heard from Ambrose Klein of blessed memory years ago, he said, nature abhors a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. Something will fill it. So when religion is removed from the equation, we have a vacuum and something will fill it, which is why we must fill that vacuum so that the likes of the Taliban do not fill that vacuum in parts around the world. And so that religious fundamentalisms that deny science and defy morality do not fill that vacuum. Or if we do not step up and define with our own religious categories and our own religious thinking what it is that brings meaning to life and defines social morality, we will find ourselves living instead in a selfish society that upholds anti-intellectualism, denigrates education, denies science, ignores public health protocols, and values some human life over other human life. A Calvinist society that blames the poor for being poor and idolizes the rich for being rich. A wicked society in which no one has any obligations to anyone else, all in the name of religion. And if that sounds a little too familiar, all the more reason for us to step up. In the name of religion, we must take our own take seriously. In the name of religion, take your own take seriously. We need to speak up. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.